Hello, this is Dr. Greg Coughlin, and I'm going to go through EnCase case creation. One of the first things to consider when you are creating a case in a tool such as EnCase is where you're going to store everything. It's a good idea to have an external drive that has been forensically prepared, meaning wiped, to store information. Now, some environments are a cloud environment where the lab has space in the cloud, but the same issue is you've got to make sure that there is no cross-contamination. One of the ways you can help assure that is when you take hashes of the image. I prefer to take an image hash when I take the image and also when I complete the investigation, just to double check and make sure that nothing has been changed. But rather than storing everything on a local computer, you probably want to have a new drive, and then in a new drive you can create a series of folders, and one of the folders you might have simply a case folder. And you possibly, on the same drive, could create another folder for the images. But again, the question is, do you want to store the images in the same place as the case files? And there's advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. An advantage to storing the image with the case file is that everything's together and it's easier to archive, and if you have to go back and review the case, you're all set. An advantage to having the image in a different location from the case files could be performance, because there's a lot of I/O going on when you're processing cases and so forth, and having things across different drives can help improve that performance. So there's a variety of other issues. Security and so forth are also things to keep in mind. But we are going to, in this series of examples, simply store the image in with the case. So I have the Mantooth image over here and the Mantooth hash file. That's what I'm going to use for today. And I'll copy those over. And again, it's important to keep the hash files with you, and they're the text file. And you can always, once you move a file, take another hash. You can use a tool like HashCalc or something like that to make sure that the hash has not changed. But you can look at the MD5 and the SHA-1s, and that's the verification. So that's that part of it. Now, once we have those together, let's get into EnCase, and this is what comes up when you first enter EnCase. A couple of things. You can go in and create a new case if you want to do everything custom, but there's this pathway piece, and the pathway basically walks you through a series of steps that you might go through. Now, with those steps, not everything is in order that you need to do, but there may be some things not included in this pathway that you need to do and so forth. But if you're just getting started, sometimes it can be helpful. But that's the pathway. I will go through, though, and do a kind of a custom approach. There is one other thing I wanted to point out. The Mantooth image is very, very small. And that's the reason that I'm using it for this example, because it'll process very quickly. Typical computer image is many files. Now, this is the Peterson image, which is a guidance image. And notice that there's an EO1, EO2, 3, 4, and so forth. Well, the first file is the EO1 in the sequence. If you have a terabyte drive, you could have perhaps 30, 40, 50 of these files, EO1 through E50, for example. The one that you point to when you're trying to open it up is the EO1, and then the forensic tool will know which files come after that, because EO1 is a standard image format, as is the extended EnCase format. Okay, enough with that. Now we're back in. I'm going to create a new case. I go in. There are several different templates. A flexible template, the basic template, forensic, etc. Now you might notice down in the case information that changes a little bit, based on the template. We'll just go with the basic one. I will tell you that these templates also create different folder structures that you can use for bookmarking and also generating your reports. But you would enter in a case number, and there's probably some sort of standard. So we can go 2019, let's just go 0601. So it'd be like June 6th or June 1st, 2019, and maybe more case information. A lot of organizations have a standard. If it's a legal case, it's assigned some sort of a case by the court systems and so forth, depending on the county or jurisdiction, etc. You might include that in the case name, but we'll just call it Mantooth. And the examiner name, you put your name in there. And then maybe a short description. You know, this could be the Mantooth computer or something like that. Now, the name and location, you can see this is going into the C drive, and I had created a folder for case, and what I might want to do is change that to that folder number. So we'll go out to that external drive, into the case folder, and that's the base case. Now, do we want to call it just that? We probably don't. We probably want to have it be probably the case number. Something like that. And then what I typically do is put that into the clipboard and then go through and paste it down into these. Now, the backup location, you may or may not want to have the backups onto the same drive as the rest of the case. Again, there are several considerations. If you do store it in the same place, you know, ease of archive, you don't have to try to hunt around to find out where all the potential fragments are for a case, because you don't want to leave evidence somewhere in an investigative computer after the case is done. So I often just back it up to the same location, the same drive that I have the case that I'm working on. The downside of that is if something happens to that drive, you have potential to lose everything. One way around that is to periodically do a backup to a second source, cloud or otherwise. Now, the backup by default will go every 30 minutes. It used to do it every 5 minutes by default or so, but they changed that to every 30. That may or may not be soon enough. I tend to like to hit the save icon quite a bit more frequently than every 30 minutes as well. This will create the case. Once you have added evidence, you'll come in and EnCase will probably look something like this. Personally, I like the tree view, so the first thing I always do is change to the tree table view. And then if you double click on the evidence, then things will start to look pretty familiar for you. A couple things, when you want to look at information within a drive, it's a hierarchical, but if you click on the green icon, we historically have called it the green home plate. That's something to be able to view, and you can go through and look at various files and so forth within that. If you wanted to look at things here as well, you can also select that and go through and browse the evidence for files created and so forth. Now, when you go over to the right, you'll notice the columns for MD5 and SHA-1, those are for hashes for individual files. We have hashed the evidence file, but the individual files within the evidence file have not yet been hashed. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, particularly if you have to do hash analysis in your case. Okay, but after you kind of orient yourself a little bit, one of the very first things that you end up doing is processing your case. And when you want to do something versus view it, there's the square area, and you can do what we call a blue check. And when you select something like that, that means you're going to do something with it. So for example, you might be able to do a bookmark or some other type of processing for that. But if we go into the entries, you can see there's other types of things. Some of them are grayed out. You have an acquire area where you can create evidence files and so forth. The device area. But what we want to do right now is we actually want to go through and do some case processing. When you're in this particular type of view, you do not see the processing area, but there's this little arrow. If you push the little arrow over and go back, now you can see the process image or process evidence. So if we did an acquire, that's if we want to acquire something that does not have a forensic image yet. You can acquire it, and then after that is done, go into the processing. So maybe it's something you're going to let run overnight or so forth. But right now, we've already got an image, so we don't need to acquire it. We're just going to process it. So when we select process, the pop-up window for case processing will appear. And we have an unprocessed evidence file that it is already kind of pre-selected, if you will. These are the options for processing, and you'll notice that some of them have exclamation points. The exclamation point means that you basically have one shot to do those. You want to do them on the first pass through processing. Otherwise, you'd have to create a new case and basically start over. They're already pre-selected. Now, you might not want to do the find email right off the bat. Perhaps you're going to just do the red ones and let it run and get that done. The reason you might come in and process evidence multiple times, well, there could be many reasons. One is simply for time. It takes a long time if you select all the options, and you might not need all the options. Another reason you'd come back in is you have been looking through the evidence and maybe come across something that hasn't been processed so far, and it's just the next logical step to come back in and do something. But we'll do the file signature analysis, which basically would make sure that if it's a JPEG, it has a JPEG header and extension and things like that match. Look for protected files, create thumbnails for the graphic files, do a hash analysis, and you can click on these to see it's going to do the SHA-1 and the MD5 and also the entropy. The entropy might take a little extra time, so if you're trying to speed up, you might not do that. However, again, if it has a red exclamation point, you only get one shot at it. Now, down in the index, text, and metadata, personal information, what areas do you want to look at? If it's going to index text and metadata, it'll index up to 64 word length. I think it's every 3 characters. I'm not positive. The more forensic tools you begin using, you're trying to remember what the parameters are for each one. Personal information, do you want to go for credit cards and so forth? Again, you can come back and do these later because they don't have the hashes. But then also in the modules, you might do the system info parser, okay, which looks like a registry if you ask me. You can go through and look for various things like plugged in USB to drives and so forth. And these are a lot of the standard things like user accounts, software installed, what kind of OS, and so forth. Pretty useful. File carver, I'm not going to do right off the bat, but you can go through and carve out deleted files perhaps by selecting various things. So for example, if we were to go for picture files, you can see all the various types of pictures that you could carve out of unallocated space. The Windows artifact, this is a Windows image, so I might want to go through and grab linked files and so forth. But that's enough for now. You can have a processing options label. That's the default. You could put in processing options 1 or something like that. But then if you do have a large drive, a terabyte drive or larger, for example, this could run for many hours, depending on how many options you've picked. I'm going to let it run. This is pretty much what I'm going to need for the Mantooth image anyway, so we'll just leave it at that and let it go. And then you can see down in the lower right, it's going to run for a little while, and we'll just let it go. Okay, now that the evidence is processed, there's a couple of things you might want to verify. One is to look to see if the hashes are there for the MD5 and the SHA-1. Note that for regular files you should have hashes, but for folders you're not necessarily going to have a hash. So what you can do is, remember, if you want to do something, you can do a check mark, and then you do device hash and do both, and it'll go through and it'll hash the folders on the drive. And if you go somewhere where you know there's some files, and these are, text files, JPEGs, you should be able to see MD5 and SHA-1 appear when it is complete. To make these appear, I just clicked the refresh button and the hash values then showed up. It's not like a Windows environment or a Mac environment where things are automatically refreshed sometimes, so you got to hit the refresh and there they are. Okay, one other thing we want to do is go back to the home area. We were at the Add Evidence screen, so if we do the back area, we can go to this case analyzer. And if we click on the case analyzer, we can go in and start processing that. It takes usually a second to show up. Click on case, let it run, and it doesn't take long with the Mantooth case. Usually 15 seconds or so will do it. What the case analyzer does is it takes information that the evidence processor created and it formats it into an easier to read, easier to find format, if you will. So it's just about complete, and one of the things you can do is also create a series of bookmarks. So let this finish. Okay, we have our various folders. So for example, in the accounts, because you remember we clicked on the registry, so forth, when we did the processing. Here's the accounts, the SIDs. You can see the hardware devices and so forth. So you might go here to find out if some USB devices have been plugged in and so forth. Various internet activity areas, history of the URLs that were entered and how many times they were searched. You can select these and bookmark them. I much prefer bookmarks to screen prints because bookmarks a lot of times gather extra information like paths and so forth. That makes it a much richer report. Also, if you've got to go back through and modify the report, you can bring it up and unselect bookmarks or add additional bookmarks into the report without much problem. So you should get into that habit of doing that. So we can see there was 142 Google searches. You can bookmark selected. Selected means you put a blue check on it. And how about we'll just call it Google. Usually you give it some sort of a descriptive. And where would you want that to be? Well, that would be an internet artifact. But you can put new folders in these by giving it a name here. Let's just call it, how about history URLs, which is the same as the folder we found it from. Okay. Various commas if you want it included. So you can take one or more of those, whatever. Click finish, and so we have bookmarked that. Let's see, let's go back to the evidence tab and I'll show you a couple other things. The case analyzer is now showing, but if you go to the indexed items, we did create an index when we did our processing, and maybe we want to look for some things. So we can, like, for example, how about Mantooth? And here's a bunch of Mantooth hits. So there's 4,800 hits just on Mantooth, but here's a bitmap. And maybe we want to do that with a gallery view to be able to see it, but that isn't a good picture. But anyway, you can just start typing things. Oh, I don't know, pizza. Okay, pizza doesn't appear on here. How about washer? Okay, so Washmeister, we got a hit on Washmeister Gmail. Well, perhaps Washer has an email address called Washermeister. There's other views you can go into, keyword views, but also there's the bookmarks. And if we go into the bookmarks area, remember the internet artifacts, we can go into the internet artifacts, and here's the history URLs, and there's this Google one that we had captured. So if we wanted to generate a report out of the bookmarks area and we wanted to include Google, we would check that. If we wanted to include all of them, we would start at the top. Okay? We can do previews and so forth. A few things to keep in mind as you walk through this. So that should get you going on how to investigate Mantooth.